Janet, you can open it up as soon as you think we've got a.
Okay, we're only at
We have a few more minutes.
Yeah, we can wait a little bit.
Yeah, we had 30 people signed up, and I guess we ended up with maybe 10 on the waiting list.
Okay.
So we should have a good group tonight.
Great. Did we open up the waiting list or not? No?
No.
No. Okay.
Felt like just too many. But Annalise is going to videotape so we can post this.
Okay.
And people who need to get it under their belts quickly can watch it online. If we have demand for another in-person one, we can schedule another in-person one. But for most people, maybe just watching it on their own time is okay.
Sounds like a plan. So maybe we'll start in 3 minutes at 5:35. There's 8 people on. Oops.
You know, Janet, since there are so few here compared to what we were expecting, why don't you just have people introduce themselves?
Okay, sounds good. So you want to start now? Andy?
I think we might as well, yeah.
All right. So welcome to Trauma, Mental Health, and Red Flags. I would remind you that unless you're speaking, please be on mute just so we can negate any background noise. I'm happy. This is the second presentation for myself, Janet Taylor, and also Andy Blanch, Dr. Blanch. Just for background, I'm a psychiatrist here in Sarasota, work for Centerstone, have a small private practice, do a long history of community mental health. I'm glad to be here. Andy, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Sure, I'm a psychologist and have worked in the area of trauma and resilience for the past 20 years or so. And I am a founding member of Sarasota Strong and really happy to be here.
Excellent. And just so you know, we are recording this session, so just be aware of that. And why don't we start? Do you want to do the introduction, Andy, for people, or? Oh, just before we start, just a couple words about the safe. This is a safe space. Whatever you have to say, you can, keep it here. If you learn something that someone else is saying, certainly you can share the learning, but just be mindful of people's confidentiality and privacy. There are no questions that you cannot ask. And just, we want you to take it all in and make sure that you understand any topics or terms that we are using. Feel free to ask if you're not sure.
Okay, let's just each introduce ourselves and say what an organization you represent or why you're here tonight and maybe what you hope to get out of it, but real quick, just, 30 seconds or less. So Fawn, do you want to start?
Sure. Good evening, everyone. My name is Fawn Pettifer, and I'm sorry, but my video is not working. I work with the 69400 mental wellness team. So we help to support 6 First Nations along the 69400 corridor, which is from Parry Sound to Sudbury to North Bay. And I'm happy to be here tonight. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Fawn. Maria? Maria Rendon, are you here? You are muted. Well, we'll come back to Maria. Juan Zilling or Zilling Juan? And I apologize if I'm mispronouncing people's names. Okay, we'll come back. Barbara Sturdivant. Okay, do people realize that they're muted?
Maybe not.
I've asked people to unmute. I can't force people to unmute though.
Okay, so Luz Ortiz, do you want to introduce yourself? Okay, Candace Coston.
Hi, Candace Coston, based out of North Carolina. I'm a military life counselor and a lot of people under a lot of stress and trauma and been trying to help them build their resiliency and self-care. So I'm excited. And that's it about me.
Fantastic. Welcome.
Yes.
Vanessa Olmos.
Hi everybody, my name is Vanessa Olmos. I am here in Los Angeles and I am an employee of Value Aces. My title is a community prevention coordinator.
Welcome. Thanks for joining us. Okay, is there anybody else who would choose to introduce themselves? If not, we're just going to move on.
Hi, I'm Barbara Sturdivant. I'm a member of the Bradenton, Sarasota chapter of the Links Incorporated. And one of my facets, we are going to be making telephone conversations to members of the Sarasota community in relations to COVID-19 and any problems or situations that we can help them with. And I have my grandbaby, so that's why I'm staying on mute.
Well, welcome, Barbara, and welcome to the grandbaby. And we really appreciate all the work that the Lynx women have put into this already so far, and your willingness to step up to the plate. So thank you.
And hello, Link Barbara. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay, is there anybody else on now who hasn't introduced themselves who would like to? Okay, then, take it away, Dr. Janet.
Okay, so as I mentioned, this is a safe space, and maybe Fawn probably has some stories that she can share. I'm glad you're on the call, Fawn, but this is just something to think about, Two Wolves, and it's a tale about an older Cherokee grandfather who was with his grandson. And he told his grandson, you know, son, inside of us, we have two wolves. One is kind and excited and thoughtful and respectful and full of joy and happy. And the other one is evil and limited and defensive and closed and angry. And his grandson looked at him and said, we have two wolves within us, and they're, you know, fighting within us. Who wins? And the grandfather said, the one that you feed. And this is just a reminder, in the work that we do, there will be a number of emotions that come up based on our day-to-day lives in terms of how we're feeling with COVID-19 and the vulnerability we feel, how we're feeling with the unrest over racism and fear. And then the work we're doing, we constantly have to be mindful of our own feelings and emotions as we deal with individuals who have been exposed to trauma and certainly are feeling their own set of circumstances. And this is just a reminder about the emotions, the 5 basic emotions, which are joy, disgust, anger, sadness, and fear. And how often, as individuals, you know, we focus on our thoughts, and our thoughts frequently can be automatic. Our thoughts can be an old narrative in our mind about ourselves or judgmental about other people. But if we pay attention to our emotions, how we're actually feeling, like what the sensations are and what we're feeling, then that can help guide us in the work that we do so that we don't get caught up in our thoughts, which can be limiting and sometimes stereotypical, so that we can really do what we need to in this demanding work. Andy, you're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. So there are just a few key things that, from my perspective, I'm really hoping that that you take away from this talk. First is a recognition that everybody you meet has likely experienced some form of trauma or another. You know, it's easy to recognize trauma and be compassionate with somebody that we know has experienced something really hard, you know, a veteran returning from a war zone, or a mom who's just seen her son shot by the cops. But other people, you know, those kind of people who just are really annoying, the people who bug you, the person who can't seem to show up at a meeting on time, the person who takes up all the airtime and doesn't let anybody else speak. Those are actually behaviors that are related to trauma experienced at various points in life as well. So the really fundamental thing to remember is that we need to be kind and compassionate to everybody, because everybody, no matter how annoying they are, everybody has a story that we know nothing about. So the second thing on the other side of that is to remember that even though everybody has experienced trauma of one type or another, people are survivors. You don't have to approach people as if they're vulnerable or damaged or fragile and handle them with care. Most people actually survive and grow from their trauma experiences. In the trauma movement, we say people often become stronger at the broken places. So it's just good to remember always that people have survived, they have coping skills, and you can call on those things. There will be challenges, obviously. People don't have any reason necessarily to trust you. And for some, particularly people who have experienced a lot of trauma, we'll talk about this a little bit later, trust may come not easily at all. It may take some real time, and part of your job will actually be to earn people's trust. You can't assume that just because you're a nice person and you're trying to do good, people will trust you. So, and then finally, and probably most importantly, you already have what you need to do this work. Janet and I are going to try to give you some helpful information, some useful tips, but if you ever start to doubt yourself and wonder whether you can do this, just take a deep breath and remember you already have what you need to do this work. The most important things that you have that you bring to this work are your life experience, your ability to connect with people and form relationships, the ability to convey information in a way that people can actually hear it, and the ability to motivate action. And those things already exist inside you. Back to you, Janet.
Thank you, Andy. And what you said just reminds me, Rumi says that the wound is where the light enters. And it is important that we don't see people who have been traumatized and who amongst us probably has not been exposed to some trauma as people who are deficient or weak, and that, you know, we have to overextend to help, that people are capable and creative and whole. So, you know, certainly in my field as a psychiatrist, we focus a lot on mental health, but more about what's wrong with people, you know, need to have a diagnosis to get paid. And certainly when people talk about mental health, usually it is from a negative aspect, but it's important to think about positive mental health. And this is just a reminder from the World Health Organization that mental health is a state of well-being in which the individual realizes his or her own abilities, can cope with the normal stress of life, can work productively and fruitfully, and is able to make a contribution to their community. And I'd also add that the World Health Organization also says that there's no physical health without mental health. And so the three components of mental health certainly are emotional well-being, and I went over what the emotions are, psychological well-being, which gets back to how people function, you know, able to get up and go to work, sleep, take care of their kids, take care of themselves, and then social well-being, how connected are people? And certainly in this day and age of COVID, people are lonely and isolated. And we know that when people are lonely and isolated, in some cases, that can be just as detrimental to health and stress as if you were a 2.5 pack smoker a day. So loneliness and isolation in some cases can be fatal, and it's important that people realize that. So the three domains of mental health are your ability to not only realize your potential, but make the most of it, exploit your potential. And that doesn't mean you have to start at the top, but from wherever you are, you can always achieve and do better. And that's not always something materially. And in fact, most of the time it's not, but how much do you learn? You know, how committed are you to learning and expanding and just taking small steps to get better? A sense of mastery over your environment. Like, what do you realize that you can control? Do you know where to go get $5 if you need $5 to buy diapers, or if you need a copay for medication? Like, how can you make your way? And then autonomy, which is your ability to identify a problem, confront it, which means look at it, you know, from a critical lens, and then solve the problem. So people who can do that tend to have positive or better mental health. Some barriers to positive mental health certainly are cultural norms in terms of the limited expectations that are placed on people in this America that we live on based on the color of their skin, their ethnicity, who they love, you know, whether they're able-bodied or not. And so it's up to individuals to not succumb to that and overcome that. Right now, certainly in America, we're living at this time where it's the myth of white supremacy versus Black Lives Matter, and really looking at the impact of 400 years of slavery as it relates to structural racism, which we know is embedded at every single institution that we deal with, and how we can be anti-racist in the sense of identifying those processes, dismantle racism and call it out when we see it. And finally, you know, for the first time, it's not just people of color who are identifying racism and then expected to dismantle it, but we have allies in that, you know, multicultural, multi-generational, the protests, people are standing up and saying we've got to do better. There are economic factors. Certainly we know that when people are low resource, live in poverty, which we know poverty impacts, you know, your ability to have financial security or where you go to school, access to healthcare, jobs, that can impact mental health. Education is the level of education achieved is one of the best predictors of health outcomes. So that certainly is important. Health status, we know that people who have access to more tend to be healthier. And the goal of all of us is to lead long and healthy lives. Social support, as I kind of mentioned, like who can people go to when they need something, which may not always be family, but do people know, you know, can they access different community organizations or access friends who are supportive to find what they need. And certainly what we're talking about today, the impact of trauma, the impact of abuse and also neglect as it relates to mental health. And certainly with children being out of school, right now, almost 30% of calls that are made to family services are by teachers and other people in the community who see kids who are out of school. And the fact that so many kids are in homes where there may be domestic violence or maybe ongoing violence, it means all of us really have to keep our eyes and ears open to really look after the well-being of our children. Just a word about the impact of racism and mental health. You know, it's really been probably the past 15 years where there have been more and more studies that are done in terms of the impact of racism on our mental health, our physical health and well-being, and know that racism, microaggressions, which are those everyday put-downs, discrimination, bias, impacts us at the cellular level. So, you know, it leads to trauma. And the body kind of being on all the time, much like people who are have been post-traumatic stress, or people have been traumatized, where every organ is firing, and certainly the impact that has on, you know, diabetes, high blood pressure, cardiovascular disease, anxiety, depression is significant. It makes people who've had racialized trauma and even trauma in general are hypervigilant, because, you know, our brain is our greatest ally in the sense it can keep us safe, it can calm us down, it can warn us of danger. But when you've been in a traumatic situation and certainly have been impacted by always having to be on, as seen as an other, you know, in this America, which will change by 2040 when there are more Black and brown people in America, to the brain, it doesn't matter. The brain is constantly just hypervigilant and on. And what happens is that the brain, you know, that's responsible for fight, flight, and freeze, signals to every organ to turn on. And so it's up to us to kind of get ourselves back in balance, which means, you know, monitoring our stress and working out on a regular basis and eating well and finding positive supports to balance that hypervigilance. Certainly life experiences, you know, people have been in the criminal justice system. For Black people in America, a Black person in America, Black adults are 3 times more likely to have lost a child by the age of 30, and Black kids are 2 times as likely to have lost a parent compared to white people, a parent by the age of 10. So the impact of loss is significant. And Dr. David Williams, a sociologist from Harvard, has shown that given everything that's going on with Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, that when an unarmed man, Black man or woman is visualized, like we watched on the news, you know, watch the videos, when communities of color see that, they are traumatized for months. Job days are missed. depression, anxiety, and white communities do not have that same effect. So you don't have to necessarily be the one who directly visualizes trauma, but you can have vicarious racial trauma and vicarious trauma from watching it and being exposed on the news and on social media. So it really is meaningful that you know and tell your patients and clients when to turn that off. And if they live in a community where they see it all the time, just teaching them how to find safe spaces within the spaces that they're in. And certainly the impact of internalized oppression or internalized racism as it limits expectations. So, we're living right now in the two pandemics. COVID-19 highlighted structural inequalities, the fact that Black people make up 13% of the population, accounted for almost 30% of deaths and continue. And certainly this pandemic of racism where we are watching police brutality. We are watching Black men and women who are still getting killed. We know that Black and brown people make up 70% of essential workers who had no choice but to go to work and are exposed to the virus. We also know that our Black and brown children, which make up a significant proportion of kids in public school, and parents are being faced with sending their kids to school where half the schools in America, some of them don't have hot water, they have standard ventilation. And our kids need to be in school, but at what cost? So there are a lot of issues that are being highlighted that are not going to be resolved in the next month or two, or maybe for a year until there's a vaccine. And all of that takes a toll on people's mental health, and certainly is an example of another traumatic condition. Some protective factors for mental health certainly are the amount of spiritual or religious involvement is a protective factor, the support that you may get from a family member or community, and then maximizing psychological resources. So one of those things is Dr. Robert Tedeschi in the late 1990s and talked about post-traumatic growth. And, this concept is not new. Historically, whether it's from the Bible or whether it's Maslow or Viktor Frankl, we know that when people suffer, usually they find a way to make it through, right? You can look at, Harriet Tubman, look at whomever your sheroes and heroes are. But post-traumatic growth specifically looked at the ability to transform an experience into one that is resilient, into one that makes you better. And how does that work? Is that through a changed narrative? We all have this narrative in our head that usually stops wherever we had an experience that may have been traumatic or something that made us question ourselves. And things that we do may be in relation to what that narrative is. Like, I never get picked, or, I never will get this because of that, right? And we have an opportunity to change that narrative by becoming more resilient. And resilience is not just making it through, but how do you thrive after a situation? And most of us, the most that we have learned is usually after a situation that could be frightening, it could be distressing, but when you think about it, you've learned through it. Could be painful. We expand how we cope in a positive way. So instead of coping with overdoing cigarettes or alcohol, drugs, sex, we focus on positive ways to cope, which is our well-being, sleep, appetite, get therapy if we need it, talk to people. We have increased wisdom, compassion, and we know that giving back, volunteering is always beneficial when people are down. And so the outcome of post-traumatic stress can be you have an improved relationship with yourself and an improved relationship with others. You see the world, you use all your senses in a new way where you appreciate things more. You are aware of your personal strengths, and we all have personal strengths. And your clients all have a personal strength. The fact that they reached out to you, they picked up the phone, they got to your offices, that's all a strength. And so often we have to remind them what those strengths are. Having a spiritual or existential belief, and existential belief is really where you understand the meaning of life. And that meaning doesn't mean it's all good, but it means whatever you're going through, it's all good, and certainly have that appreciation. So that's post-traumatic growth, which we have the potential to do. And so as whether you're a gatekeeper, whether you work in a clinic, whether you're in any sorts of community work where you interface with the public, the one thing that we want to do is not compare ourselves to other people. And we do that by being non-judgmental. We use motivational interviewing, which means you find the discrepancy. If someone says that, their goal is to get their GED and you've, taken them basically to class, or, found Zoom classes or done whatever, and they're still not doing it, then our job is to identify what is the discrepancy, what's stopping them from getting what they want. And sometimes it may be that narrative that they can't do it. Sometimes it's low expectation. Maybe that their computer doesn't work. Like, we have to find that discrepancy out so we can help them reach their goal. Support self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is your confidence in your ability to do something. So after you've taught somebody something, like what their self-efficacy is and how comfortable do they think they can do it, which means as teachers, and we're all teachers, we teach them by saying, like, you can use teach back, like we've talked about this, tell me what we just said. Certainly if there's a language barrier, you want to teach in their language and make sure that both people understand. And we want to ask and don't assume. And number one, no matter what their dreams and goals are, our job is not to tear them down, but to champion their potential and purpose and help them find a way that they can make it through. So at this point, I'll pause. Said a lot. Remember, you're on mute, and see if there are any questions about what Andy and I have talked about. Anyone? Comments, questions?
Yeah, this is Fawn. I'm really interested in how, because I'm from Canada, and how you put racial with the pandemic as two pandemics. That really interests me. And I'm just, because we're from a minority group as well. We're First Nations here in Canada, and we're treated very similarly in some aspects, not in everything, but in some aspects.
A lot, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, and so that particular portion of what you presented really does interest me, because it hasn't been talked about here in Canada. And because we're so isolated, most First Nations are isolated in their own communities. Some have actually restricted access. So there's no coming in, or there's very little going out. So that's concerning for me. And when you also listed the internal oppression, I can definitely relate to that as well. So I just wanted to mention that.
I'm glad you said that. I actually lived in Vancouver, Canada for 6 years, so know kind of the plight. Now, obviously not as well as you do of First Nations, but I mean, the two pandemics is not an original idea. A lot of people have written about it, but certainly we know that racism is a public health issue. And also, if you look at least in America, which I'm sure parallels even in Canada, the fact for historically, in terms of, the systemic racism that's happened in terms of the lack of education about the history of Blacks in this country for 400 years, the deliberate destruction of Black communities, the deliberate destruction through policies, policing, laws and racism that have really been meant to hold up this myth of white supremacy. And that, there's a long history of racism and bias in medicine. That has been documented. Medical Apartheid is a great book I recommend by Harriet Washington, and that really documents it. But, when you look across the 400 years of this country, there are so many just deliberate insults that have happened. And so for the Native Americans here, like basically in schools here, we stopped learning about the history of Native Americans after the late 1800s. That's another example of racism. We don't learn about, like, even for COVID-19 here, the contracts that were made that were supposed to supply the reservations with PPE, and like half of them didn't get it and got things that were really old in terms of testing. I mean, it's another example of a disparity like now in 2020. So there are lots of parallels, and the pandemic is not just about disease. It also is about these racialization of the processes that continue. And that's why racism is a public health issue.
Just a question, and you can even leave it in the chat. Do you have any references towards that portion of it, so that I can just read up a little bit more? Because you said that there has been some literature that has been
Yeah, about the 2 pandemics. Certainly. Yeah, I can definitely get that to you.
Janet, if you send the citations to Annalise, she can send them out to everybody who was registered.
Yeah, definitely.
Other people might be interested as well.
Sure, thanks. Any other questions or comments? Any comments, Andy?
No.
Okay.
Ready to
We'll push on.
go.
All right, we'll push on. If anybody has a question, just let us know.
Yeah, and don't forget you can use the chat. Annalise can be, following the chat, and if something comes up, she'll pass it on to us, interrupt us. So the next section, we're going to talk about how to respond to the impact of trauma and toxic stress. And the most important thing when you're thinking about how to respond is to start by asking the right question. And in the trauma movement, you've probably heard it 100 times, but it's worth repeating. Sort of the essence of being trauma informed is asking not what's wrong with you, but what happened to you. So it's a reframe, and when you get to the place where you can see somebody who's acting really badly, really maybe self-destructively, maybe is just, being very aggressive or angry or mean to you, and instead of saying to yourself, what's wrong with that man anyway, you say, geez, I wonder what happened to him that's leading him to behave in this way. That's really the fundamental reframe of a trauma-informed approach. So Janet, next slide. Then this slide is really a conceptual model that I put up here because I think it's really helpful to use or to keep in mind to capture all of what Dr. Taylor was just talking about. I mean, this just shows that you as an individual are affected by the family context around you and by the context of your friends and colleagues. And all of you are affected by the organizations that you interact with, which of course are affected at every moment by the society that we're in. And often when you're talking about trauma, people will focus on the individual level, or maybe they'll focus at another level. But most of us have had some sort of traumatic experience at every level. And not only have we experienced trauma at every level, but it's probably affected our ability to live effective and healthy and happy lives at every level. So, for example, at the individual level, maybe you were in a car accident or you had an illness. Family, maybe you had alcohol or drugs in the family, or domestic violence, or a death in the family when you were very young. Maybe you've experienced bullying or betrayal by friends and colleagues. Maybe you worked for an organization that was biased against you, or you got laid off for no reason, and you feel like it was a vendetta, and maybe it was. And of course, we've talked some about racism already, and poverty, and some of the other social factors that lead to trauma. On the other side, on how trauma has affected you, when we talk about trauma, often people jump immediately to PTSD. Like trauma means PTSD, and that's the only thing that trauma leads to. In fact, PTSD is one manifestation of trauma. It's a very specific set of diagnosable clinical symptoms. But in fact, trauma affects absolutely every aspect of our lives. The specific ways that it affects us depends to some extent, to a large extent, on when it happened. Because if it happens young, when the brain is still developing, that has certain impacts. If it happens in middle school, when you're trying to negotiate your relationship with peers, it's going to have a different kinds of impacts. But trauma can affect your ability to learn, to pay attention, moving out again from the center. It can affect your ability to parent, to be a good parent. It can affect your ability to form lasting and intimate relationships. It can affect your ability to hold a job, and it can affect your ability to reach your potential and make the contribution to society that you could potentially have made. So in your work, I just encourage you, when you're talking with people, in all likelihood, they will focus in on one trauma that happened to them or two traumas. But if you really want to understand the person in their complexity, keep this in mind and see if you can work with them to talk about all of these different levels or some of these different levels. Next slide. So these are the 6 principles of trauma-informed practice. And the first thing you might say as you look at these principles is, well, what's the big deal here? I mean, these are sort of safety, trust, empowerment. I mean, this is sort of motherhood and apple pie, right? I mean, who could be against safety and empowerment? And that's true. These are actually principles of good practice in interacting with any other human being. So they're not just specific to interacting with trauma survivors. But the fact is that these principles are particularly important when you're dealing with people who have unresolved trauma issues, okay? Because there are certain predictable experiences that trauma survivors have and characteristics that they have that relate to these 6 principles. So if you can keep these 6 principles in mind and act in a way that would create these things in the lives of the people you're working with, you can be pretty sure you're responding in the best possible way for trauma survivors. So just going through them quickly. Safety, I mean, that's got to be number 1, right? I mean, just by definition, trauma survivors have experienced, they've been afraid of something, they've experienced threat, they've experienced loss. So creating a safe environment is absolutely the number 1 essential strategy for working with trauma survivors. Trauma also destroys people's belief in the goodness and fairness of the world very often, particularly if the trauma came at the hands of parents or a loved one or somebody that you could reasonably assume what should be looking out for your best interests. So when a caretaker or a loved one is the source of trauma, we call that betrayal trauma. And that really affects people's ability to trust others. And it takes time often. Somebody who has real trust issues was probably experienced trauma at the hands of a loved one at some point. The next 2 principles, collaboration and empowerment, voice and choice, they really have to do with control. And what you'll find is that trauma survivors often have a very high need for control. They try to control everything that's going on around them, because that's the way they make themselves feel safe, right? I mean, if you've been traumatized, you lost control over your life and your well-being for at least a moment and maybe longer than that. So control becomes really important. And so any way that you can help trauma survivor feel in control, make decisions, that's going to help. Rather than telling people what to do, if you're collaborative and you join in partnership in a sharing mutual kind of relationship, you're less likely to trigger that need for control. Likewise, peer support is related in the sense that trauma almost always occurs in the context of an unequal power relationship. Traumas most frequently, it results from a misuse of power of some kind. And that leaves trauma survivors feeling powerless. And one of the consequences of feeling powerless and having experienced trauma at the hands of somebody who had power over you is not trusting people in authority. So a very common thing for trauma survivors is not trusting anybody who has power and not trusting anybody who has the semblance of authority. So for example, you'll often see that trauma survivors don't want to go to doctors. If they make an appointment, they won't show up. They don't want to use services because why should they trust the system, the people who have power over them, the people who have privilege and authority? So often it works better. Peer support is a more effective way of interacting with trauma survivors than professionals or people in authority. So information that comes from somebody at the same level of power, somebody that you don't feel has power over you, may be easier received than information coming from an authority figure. And then finally, trauma often leaves people feeling worthless. They really start to doubt their own self-worth as a human being. And so one of the most important and effective things you can do is encourage people to value their own history, their own culture, their own healing traditions, because those things are our strengths, and it helps people remember that they have inherent worth as a human being, as a member of whatever identity group that they associate themselves with. So next slide. So what do you do if somebody is too upset to even have a rational conversation with you? In order to answer that question, we have to take a little detour into the brain. We're not going to go into all the neurobiology of trauma in depth, but there are a few things that are really helpful to remember. Dr. Janet already mentioned the fight, flight, freeze response, which I'm sure we're all familiar with, right? That when something that's dangerous happens in the environment, our brain releases all kinds of hormones. They flood the body. That helps us concentrate and gives us strength so that we can either fight, freeze like a bunny so whatever's after us won't find us, or get the H out of the situation. That's what we're programmed to do. It's very, it's very adaptive. That keeps us safe. And then afterwards, of course, you go back to normal, right? Gradually, all those hormones go away. So if you think of, you're driving down the road and somebody swerves in front of you and you have to, jerk the car away and you almost get in an accident. Remember that feeling of the adrenaline just flooding your body. But then you're safe, you didn't get in an accident, and gradually, right, you return to normal. That's the way it's supposed to work. But imagine if you lived in a situation where you were fearful all the time and your body never had a chance to go back to homeostasis. So if you were a child and you never knew when your father was going to come home drunk and beat up your mom, or if you were a person of color and you never knew when your young son might get into a run-in with the cops, that kind of constant negative environment we talk about as toxic stress, because it's not a single traumatic event, but it's stress that is toxic over time. So the fight, flight, freeze response happens in the back part of the brain, which, just for ease of remembering, when we're talking to kids, we talk about the lizard brain and the wizard brain. Okay, the wizard brain is the front part of the brain. That's where all the smart stuff happens, right? That's where you think and you reason and you plan and you make decisions. That's where you talk. That's where all the smart stuff happens. The back part of the brain, the lizard brain, you know, think of a gecko that scurries away when it thinks it's in danger. That's where the instinctive stuff happens and the emotionally driven responses. And why this is important is that if you're traumatized, if you're under extreme stress, you're operating out of the lizard brain. You're back in that back part of your brain. So you literally cannot think, okay? You may have heard the expression scared speechless, right? There's actually truth to that. If you're in a panic state, you may not be able to talk because you're in the back of your brain. You're not in the front of your brain. That's why we make this mistake with kids a lot. Get a kid who's in a meltdown and we say, all right, let's sit down and talk about what just happened. Or you try to teach them why, you know, something that they did was wrong. It isn't going to work because they're not in their wizard brain and they've got to get back into the wizard brain first. So the 3 R's actually were developed by somebody named Bruce Perry, who's done a lot of work on trauma in the brain and its impact over time. And he says, okay, what we have to remember is you have to regulate first, then relate, and only then can you reason. So if somebody is dysregulated, emotionally upset, out of control, or just really, really bent out of shape, you have to help them regulate their nervous system, get them back into the wizard brain before you try to give them information or have a rational conversation or get them to make a good decision. So regulate first, then relate, build a bridge, a connection somehow, connect with that person to person, so that they'll have a reason to want to listen to you. And only then, when you're regulated and you've got some kind of relationship, can you get into a place where you'll be able to reason. So that's real important if you're trying to convey information about COVID and somebody is dysregulated. You could be the best communicator in the world, but if they're dysregulated, they're not going to be able to hear what you're telling them. So that's an important thing to remember. A couple other things about the brain before we move on. Janet mentioned the fact that witnessing trauma can be just as damaging as experiencing it yourself. That's partly because there's something in the brain called mirror neurons. And the mirror neurons are actually the basis for empathy. So that the mirror neurons are what allow us to experience and feel what another person experiences or is experiencing or feeling at the moment. And they're what make it so that the brain actually doesn't make a distinction between watching somebody being beat up and being beat up yourself. And it also makes it possible for us to influence each other. So if somebody is angry, your mirror neurons are likely to register anger, and you may become angry in response. So it's just important to remember that that's going on in your brain. And in terms of regulation, we'll go to the next slide. How do you regulate? How do you help people regulate if they are dysregulated? The most important thing, this also is Bruce Perry's work, is to remember that rhythmic, repetitive motion actually calms and regulates the nervous system. Any kind of rhythmic, repetitive action. Okay, easy to remember, right? What do you do if a baby's crying? You rock the baby. It is a natural healing process that actually helps the brain heal. And And we do it all the time in all kinds of ways without even realizing it. But if you know it, then you can help people do it intentionally. In fact, if you have a storefront or an office and you're working with highly traumatized people, have a rocking chair there, because people will sit in the rocking chair and they'll naturally rock, or a swing, and that's going to help them calm down. Other things that people do naturally: playing hoops, petting a dog or a cat, going for a walk, chopping vegetables. There's so many different, eating popcorn. There's a theory that the reason popcorn seems addictive, it's not just that people like the butter and the salt, although that's true too, but you eat popcorn in a rhythmic, repetitive way. And that's part of the reason eating popcorn seems like to really settle people down. So for children and youth, the singing and clapping games that kids do naturally, music, dancing, all those kinds of things can really help regulate a child. I will also say that for adolescents, video games are a very calming strategy. They really help regulate the nervous system. Now, that's not to say, unlimited screen time and all of that, but we do hear a lot about limiting kids' access to screen time, and that's a good strategy. But let's keep things in perspective. If you have a youth who's highly dysregulated, it might be good to let them go and do 20 minutes of screen time with a video game. So those are all things that you can do in person. What do you do if you're on the telephone? If you're one of the Lynx ladies and your contact is telephonic, you can't very well say, let's go for a walk. So there are things you can do. First of all, if you notice somebody it seems to be really, really upset and is having a hard time concentrating on the conversation, they need to have some regulation. You probably want to ask them first if they would be interested in doing something. That's to give them some control, right? So, you could say, you seem really upset. Would you be open to doing a grounding exercise or some breathing before we try to talk more about the COVID issue? Grounding you can do over the phone. Just ask people to name something that they can see, something that they can hear, something they can feel, something they can smell, and something that they can taste right now at this moment. Very simple. It immediately brings people back into the body, immediately grounds people, and helps to regulate the nervous system. Any kind of conscious breathing techniques. You may have your favorite deep breathing technique. You can, go online, and everybody has their own favorite, but even 30 seconds of conscious breathing is very, very helpful. Well, you think about it, breathing is rhythmic and repetitive, right? So breathing consciously is creating a rhythmic, repetitive motion that you're paying attention to. That can be really, really helpful. And just to remember, in-breath tends to energize, out-breath tends to calm. So depending on whether the person is is really lethargic and depressed, you might want to energize a little bit. If they're anxious, you might want to calm them down. So that's good to know. And then, of course, most important of all, right, you're going to stay calm. No matter what's going on, it's your job to stay calm, because remember those mirror neurons, right? Whatever you do, they're going to be picking up. So if you can stay calm yourself, that's a tremendous help. Okay, next slide. And here's what I was talking about at the beginning. The greatest tool in your toolkit, the very most important tool in your toolkit is you. In order to use yourself effectively with other people, you have to be self-aware. You've got to be watching yourself as carefully as you're watching the person you're interacting with. And you need to be authentic. Okay, you may, in the course of interacting with people, you may run across something, something may happen, the person may say something that reminds you of a trauma that's happened in your own life. And maybe you'll be able to just observe it and let it go by. That's a very Buddhist way of being. That's like the guy in the picture, right? Just kind of look at it. Oh, there's a trigger. That's making me anxious, but you can let it go. That's great if you can do that. But it's possible you won't be able to do that 100% of the time. Something may happen that causes you to react in some way, makes you emotional, makes it hard for you to focus. And it's possible that your reaction could upset the other person. So you can be triggering and re-triggering each other, totally unintentionally. The best thing to do if something happens that upsets you in any way is to acknowledge it. Just say, you know, what just happened made me feel X, Y, Z. I can promise you that people are going to know anyway. Trauma survivors have amazing radar because of their need and the hypersensitivity to what's going on interpersonally. They're going to know that something's going on with you. If you're honest and you acknowledge that something's going on with you, you're going to increase people's trust in you. And it's perfectly okay not to be perfect. You're not there to fix people's problems. You're there to listen and try to be supportive and to connect. And being authentic is one of the best ways you can do that. Okay, next slide. So this is kind of a summary. Again, remember I said, if you can remember a little bit about the way trauma affects people, and if you remember the 6 principles of trauma-informed practice, I believe you'll be able to handle just about anything that comes along, except really extreme situations, and Janet's going to talk about those next. So, for example, what would you do if the person you're with is feeling unsafe? Well, now you know probably the first thing you would do is to ask them what might make them feel safer, because feelings of safety are totally unique to individuals. What makes one person feel safe is going to make another person feel unsafe. So don't assume that what makes you feel safe is going to work for anybody else. So you might want to ask them. You might want to give them the opportunity to make very small decisions, because that's going to put them in control, right? Make them feel safe. So do you want to take this questionnaire first over the phone, or would you like to tell me what's going on in your life? Let them make decisions. Do you want to talk about it here, or would you prefer to go into my office? Do you want me to leave the door open, or should I close it? To the extent that you can have people making decisions, that will help. Tell them what's coming next. Okay, after we finish this, we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. Because knowing what comes next, again, gives people a sense of safety and control. So how about if people are angry? What are you going to do if you run into somebody who's angry? Well, first, you're going to be calm, right? Non-judgmental, because you remember those mirror neurons. And you're going to listen and listen and listen, and you don't actually have to say or do anything, because you know that their anger isn't about you, and chances are it isn't even about the situation. It's probably something that happened in their past that's been triggered. And by the way, the larger the emotional response you get from somebody, if one of those outside responses, so you say something and people lose it and you're left saying, what was that all about? The bigger the emotion, the more likely it is that it's related to a previous trauma and not what's going on in the moment. So if people blame themselves, trauma survivors often blame themselves both for what happened to them and for everything else that goes on in their life. And right now, people are probably blaming themselves for not handling COVID very well, for not being the perfect mother. The first thing you can do if somebody's in that headset, is just remind them that they're having a normal reaction to abnormal circumstances, that everything they're feeling is a normal reaction to the craziness that's going on around us. And just normalizing it is helpful sometimes. And you can also remind people that everybody copes with stress and trauma in their own way, and they need to cut themselves a break. You know, if they need to drink an extra glass of wine at night, it's okay. I mean, it might not be the healthiest thing in the long run, but people are coping the best way they know how. And often a lot of things that we call symptoms or we think are bad behaviors or maladaptive behaviors, those in fact are people's coping strategies. Okay, they are coping with the impact of a life of trauma. They're coping with circumstances around them, and those coping strategies work for them. So you don't want to take away people's coping strategies before you give them something else. So that's just something that's important to remember. What if people don't trust you? Well, you can tell them it's okay not to trust you. You know, I'm going to give you some information about COVID. I understand if you don't trust me, you don't trust that information. Check it out with somebody you do trust. Give them alternative ways to validate information or make decisions. And of course, tell them that you don't know something if you don't, and believe them whenever they say. So next slide. If I've got a sun problem here, I'm having a hard time seeing my screen. If people feel powerless, remind them that they're survivors and ask them what worked in the past. We all do have coping strategies. We've gotten through incredible stuff earlier in lives. So, you know, help them remember what they've done in the past that's worked for them and what they have control over. If they're feeling isolated and hopeless, one thing you might want to try is encouraging people to tell you a story about their lives. That's going to help them remember that they do have important connections and people that they can count on. And rather than, if they're isolated, rather than suggesting that they reach out for support, especially with older people who don't like to ask for help, you might want to, remind them that there are others who could use their support, because it may be easier for people to reach out to support somebody else than to reach out and ask for help. And the same thing's happening. You know, it's just framed differently. People resent you interfering. You ask questions and let people come up with their own solutions. You be a coach, not an expert. And if people are stuck, often the best thing to do is to try to get them to remember who they are at their core and build on their own history, religious, cultural traditions. It's counterintuitive, but sometimes helping people focus on something that is easy and familiar and makes them feel comfortable and competent will give them the strength they need to try something new. So next slide. Questions? I have to move this. Anybody have any questions or comments? Okay.
All right, and I just want to echo one thing you said about storytelling. And you know, when we have people tell us a story, it helps them, because when they are telling the story, it helps them connect the thoughts and things that happen with their feelings and emotions. So it can be healing just in that process. But any other questions or comments, thoughts? Okay. So now we're going to move to red flags and how to handle issues that you may run into. And this is when, we talk about positive mental health, but we really want to talk about some cases where people may have a mental disorder, understanding that half of all Americans will meet the criteria for diagnosable mental disorder or condition in their lifetime. Doesn't mean that they all have, we all have schizophrenia, bipolar, but certainly whether it's an adjustment disorder, grief reaction, there are people who would qualify for having some sort of mental disorder. And it's one that really interrupts thinking, behaving, how people react, and even how they respond to stimuli. So Andy talked a little bit about, I think did a really good job in terms of, regulation and what happens when people feel confused, feel in conflict, and the lizard brain kind of hijacks that wizard brain and makes people feel more anxious and like they have to do something. And that at every time we have that opportunity to slow down, to regulate and to reason, which I think is so crucial. The other aspect too is what we know that women who are pregnant and carrying a fetus, and when they're in domestic violence situations or under chronic stress, have been extremely traumatized and then have more trauma, that it actually can change the brain of the fetus and prime it so that at lower levels, they, infants can grow up and take less triggers to be depressed or anxious. So, those conditions that women are in really can impact the health of their fetus. And with mental health and trauma, certainly it impacts how people learn, it impacts, how we remember, impacts how we may interact with other people. And knowing that trauma, and especially, whether it's post-traumatic stress disorder or trauma, can impact decision-making, sometimes create a void in how empathic, which, gets back to those mirror neurons other people are, in terms of regard to feelings. I've worked in jails a lot and still work with people who are criminal justice involved. And rarely, ever, do I meet someone who's just such a sociopath that you feel like there's absolutely like no hope at all. Most of the people, 99% of the men and women that I've seen who are incarcerated or continue to get arrested have been physically abused or sexually abused, and that's men and women, which really shows the impact that coming from a background of trauma, where there could be neglect or physical abuse, how it truly impacts people. And going back to what Andy showed with Uri Bronfenbrenner's about, how like the individual's a microsystem and how things that happen and experiences can impact every aspect of their life. It totally does. So know that certainly there can be trauma and that impacts our mental health. And also just a quick note about racial trauma, and in particular implicit bias. If we all are biased, if you have a brain, you're biased, but what happens with implicit bias or is when people make a stereotype and bias and discrimination, our brain takes in 11 billion bits of information every second from our bodies and from the environment, and can only consciously process 50. So to these shortcuts that happen when we make assumptions about people, the color of their skin, who they love, hair type, all kinds of things, we make those assumptions, and frequently, most of the time, we're wrong. So it really is about when you're in a situation and you find that, you may be feeling a certain way or say something that, maybe lands the wrong way with people. It's really an opportunity for you to kind of reassess that and reflect and understand that, something unconscious may have come out. And once things are unconscious that come out, it's your responsibility to fix them. So as whether you're a coach, whether you are calling people on the phone, whether you're a therapist or work within communities, there will be times when you're faced with situations of people who may be in some sort of crisis. So I'm going to start at the bottom, at the gray zone, where, maybe someone tells you they're really distressed. I haven't been able to go get my medication. I'm afraid to go out because of COVID. I don't have money for the copay, and I'm not feeling like myself. And so, or people can say, I feel like I'm going to lose it. And so unless you are trained in assessing people who are actively suicidal or actively homicidal, when someone tells you that, one of the things you can do, check in with yourself and see how frightened you may feel. And again, if they're able to reason and calm down, and maybe it's that they haven't taken their meds or meds are there, they can do it. Maybe they missed an appointment, you can remind them to do that. So that's kind of gray zone where you don't feel overly, you're alert and aware, but you don't feel overly frightened, and you feel like the person is safe to do what they do. Knowing in mental health, we cannot force people to take medication. The only way you can force someone to take medication is illegally. So a judge has to do it. So no matter how psychotic someone is, no matter how much they need something, for most of us, there's absolutely nothing you can do unless they're a danger to themselves or others. And then it's a matter of getting them to a safe place, or need be, having a court order. But for most people, it's not like that. The yellow zone would be if you come across someone and they definitely tell you they're depressed. They may feel helpless. They may feel hopeless. Again, if someone says they want to kill themselves, it's not up to you to talk them out of it. It's, you can gauge and say, maybe, do you have a weapon? Do you have a plan? And if they have a plan, then that elevates them definitely to the red zone, which, you don't try to fix it. You call 911. If someone's high on substances, depending on how redirectable they are, if you feel like they're making a threat to hurt you, to hurt someone else, or there certainly isn't, little children around, you call 911 and you get some help. And we'll talk about nowadays what it can be like in certain communities to even engage the police. I still think we have to, but know that most police officers that I've come into contact with, especially around mental health issues, are trained not to re-traumatize people, but sometimes you need that show of force to get someone to get some help. And the other yellow zone, if somebody, let's say they're in danger of losing their apartment, or they've lost their job or house, but again, are not saying they want to hurt themselves or someone else, then, there are resources that you can help them with. But at any time, if you feel threatened, or someone threatens to hurt you, they threaten to hurt themselves or someone else. If you come across an incident where a child has been abused, someone's being physically abused, elder abuse, or domestic intimate partner abuse, it really is out of your hands, and you have to get authorities involved so then they can make a decision and keep people safe. So if someone's actively suicidal, actively homicidal, there's some event going on where people are getting hurt, it's not up to you to fix it. I don't care how talented you are. You need to get extra help. And unfortunately, the police, for the most part, for some people, that's going to be it. And you don't have to feel guilty about it, because when you get them to a hospital or you get them assessed, hospitals don't admit people that don't need to be admitted. So if they get assessed and they're safe, they can go home, they'll get an appointment. If they need to be kept, they'll be kept. But that's not your decision. That falls upon the decision of the healthcare provider. Andy alluded to some tips for de-escalation, but the first is just to be calm. And when somebody's agitated, the last thing you need to do is be agitated with them. So just keep yourself calm, keep your voice calm, non-confrontational, eye contact, not direct staring, but certainly people need to see that you see them. And in some cases, if someone may be paranoid, like staring at them directly, and they'll usually tell you, like, why are you staring at me? What are you doing? But make sure that you have your eye on the person, and don't, you're not looking down all the time. You just need to let people know they see them. You want to create some space so that you're not upon them, but certainly that, you can move around if you need to. If a door is open, I would always be mindful of where the door is in case you have to exit, and always be mindful where the door is in case they want to leave. If somebody wants to leave, let them walk by. You don't have to stop them. Let them go. You want to speak slowly, clearly, gently, paying attention to what they're saying and what you're saying. Show that you're listening. There are 3 ways that we listen. The first way is we're listening to people and thinking about what we're going to say next, which is not optimal. The second way is that we listen to understand, which is certainly optimal, but the best is when you can look at someone and that nonverbal communication where you are understanding what their emotional state is and they are understanding yours. And so clearly, you might have a lot of things you want to say, but just listen deeply to communicate. Always want to explain why you're there. Always want to get their permission to be there. You don't want them to sign anything without their permission and understanding, but just be very clear about what you are, why you're there, and what you can do, and then demonstrate that concern, which Andy talked about, both in your actions, in terms of you don't want threatening poses, you want to be relaxed, And then verbally, like, how can I help, or speaking in a calm way, or, you know, I can see that you're having some trouble, and explaining why you're there. Some red flags: if someone is psychotic, where they're not making sense, they're jumping around literally and also with their words, and you can see they're distressed, maybe haven't taken a shower, you know, just feel kind of just desperate. On the other hand, some people can be acutely psychotic and not say a word, but you can tell they're scared inside. That's a red flag that you need extra help. Maybe if there's a family member around, you can ask, like, how long have they been like this? Or do you need help? Do they have a doctor? And you can certainly contact their doctor. You know, with HIPAA, as a family member or even somebody from the community, you can always call a doctor and tell what your concerns are. They can't tell you necessarily, but you are always able to do that. So that's something to keep in mind. If there's been a recent loss, you know, or death, and a loss could be the loss of a pet, the loss of people who were their friends who moved away. Certainly with COVID, there have been lots of changes. All of those things can trigger people's emotional state. If someone's actively suicidal, they're saying they're going to kill themselves and they have a plan, definitely a red flag. You know, social isolation, again, isolation can be fatal. So it's just really important to ask people, like, you know, do you talk to anybody on a regular basis? What's your social network like? I'm not saying that people who are criminals are necessarily violent. I'm certainly not saying people who have chronic mental illness, schizophrenia, are more violent than anyone else. But if you have someone that definitely has a violent criminal history and they tell you, like, I've hurt people who don't listen to me. If you don't get out, I'm going to hurt you too, then you listen. And that's when you listen. And then certainly individuals who are actively threatening, in the sense of may pick up something or just are trying to scare you or menacing, you have nothing to prove. Just get out of there and get out of there safely. So those are all red flags, most of which hopefully you'll never come across, but sometimes you do. And I think the key point is to listen to your intuition. If you know they have an underlying mental health illness, it's not up to you to talk them out of it, but get them someplace where they are safe and you are safe as well. So before we move into the scenarios, any questions about what we've said, Andy and I have said, because we've said a lot? Thoughts? Okay, so you may want to unmute, because this is really a group activity right here. I'll read scenario 1 and then Andy can read scenario 2. And so basically, scenario 1 is, you walk into an apartment building, and as you enter the hallway, you hear loud yelling and what sounds like breaking glass coming from the door that you're about to knock on. Taking a deep breath, you knock anyway. A male voice answers gruffly, "Who is it?" Quickly identifying yourself and why you're there, the door opens slightly. As you peer inside, you notice a small child crying, and the woman who answered the door appears to have the outline of a handprint on her cheek. She softly asks if you can come back, and the door closes with a force. What's your assessment? What will you do next, and why? Anyone want to chime in?
Well,
Yeah.
there's obviously some harm being done. And there are 2 people who are in danger of being harmed some more, because you don't know if it's stopped.
Right.
So I don't know how well the cops are, but I would think that would be, you know, that would be a reason to call 911, because there's harm being done.
Definitely. Definitely. And I like the way you said that. There's harm being done. You're not sure why. So certainly you want to, top of mind is to keep people safe and let people who are used to doing some sort of assessment or separating people or doing whatever they need to do that for sure. Anyone else have any comments, thoughts? Andy, any thoughts? Sounds like someone else. Yes. Okay. Andy, any thoughts?
So those of you who are on the phone, on a phone bank, are not gonna maybe walk into situations that are this clear cut. But you can sometimes tell on the phone that something is going on as well. If you're talking to a woman and she seems really anxious to get off the phone, she's in a hurry, she just really wants to get you off the phone, it could be because she's in a really bad situation, or and in that case, you might want to ask, can I call you back immediately, in 5 minutes? Or, try to do something that doesn't compromise her. Remembering that safety is the most important thing. But if an abuser knows that you're there and are going to interfere, that could actually put her at risk as well. So it's a very difficult subject that calls sometimes for some fine discriminations between, if I intervene, am I going to put her in more danger than if I do nothing? So these are sort of complex issues, and there are domestic violence resources that can be really helpful. So even if you're not calling 911, if you have any thoughts, you're on the phone and you have any thought that there might be something going on, you might want to call the domestic violence hotline and talk it through with them, because they're experienced in these situations. I mean, this is what they do for a living, and they'll be able to make a determination about whether whether an action is necessary and helpful at this time, or how else to intervene. So there are other situations where it may not be so obvious that you need to call 911, but you still have questions. You can call other people for help and advice about that.
Yeah, and I would add, also just to remember that trauma, the key to trauma is really limiting exposure. And when little children are involved, you don't have to be a mandated reporter to really take a second look for a child. I recently had a case where a woman, I work in a medication assisted treatment clinic, so people come in who need treatment for opiates, and a woman came in homeless, she was obviously high, had her child was, I think, about 15 months old. Both were dirty, and she indicated that, she was living on the street because she had been on this domestic violence situation, had no diapers, no food. There was no way I could let her walk out with this child without doing something. So I encouraged her to call ACS, which she didn't, and I told her I would, and she was very angry, but made the report. They tracked her down, and then they were able to get her into a domestic violence apartment, and she had a caseworker, got childcare for her daughter. She's in parenting classes. And the next time I saw her, she was mad at me and she left. But the next time I saw her, she said, "Thank you." And so, not that thanks is what I needed, and frankly, I told her, you're an adult, the decisions you're making are up to you, but I care about that little child who's with you. So sometimes, obviously you don't want to overreach for everything, but when people make the assessments, if ACS will not take a case that they don't think is reportable, doctors will not admit people who, do not meet criteria for admission, but at least you have gotten them assessed and finding more resources. So, and then you can always talk it over, with the supervisor, or talk it over with the resources that you have. Any comments, questions?
Okay, so here's scenario number 2. As you are about to hang up from a call, the person that you are talking to says, matter-of-factly, "You just saved my life by talking to me." What would you say next? What information do you need? What actions would you take? who would you notify? Okay, you guys. You're going to be out there.
Well, I mean, if it's being said matter of factly, I mean, you would want to maybe ask a couple more questions, like, I don't know, what do you mean by that? Like,
Yeah.
you know, or just to make sure that that there's no threat of suicide behind that statement, and just to make sure that it was being said matter of factly, because you know, sometimes I could just say that out of the blue, like, you know, just because I felt so much better, you know, not because I was thinking of suicide, but it would be helpful to find out more just by just a couple of, you know, questions, or even one more, like, what do you mean by that?
Absolutely.
And then
Yeah.
it might not even mean that you have to take any action further than that. Just like, okay, I'll talk to you again. You know, so you'd have to get more information for sure.
I think that's a wonderful response, because that statement is so hard to interpret without further information. I mean, it could be just an off the hand, off the cuff kind of joking response that means nothing, or there could be something more serious going on. So I think that's exactly the right answer. You need more information before you can determine whether you need to take any action at all or notify anybody. Other thoughts or comments on this one?
And so talking about somebody's, when they say they're suicidal, asking them more does not make them more suicidal. But like, as you just said, I mean, certainly you could say, what do you mean by that? If they say, well, you know, I have pills in front of me and I was going to take them, then that certainly elevates the conversation, because then they have a plan and they're in danger. Or if they just say, I was just saying that, or if they just say I was depressed, you know, but I don't really want to do it. You know, you could ask if they have a doctor and encourage them to call the doctor, or, you know, is it okay? Is there somebody, a family member? Is it okay if I, you know, you always want to ask permission that I let them know. But talking about it does not make people more suicidal. And so in some cases you may have to get a little more information so you can make the right decision. And for each and every one of you, you should always know, in terms of if there's a supervisor you work with or some other chain of command, if you have a question when something like this happens, or who you can notify, so that you're not holding on to it yourself, and certainly don't feel like you have to be the ultimate decision maker. Any other thoughts about this? Okay, you guys are a quiet group. Okay.
So this is yours, Janet.
Yep.
The self-care piece.
Yep.
Although
So
I put the slide together, but.
Yeah. No, so this is just a reminder that, you know, in the work we're doing as first responders, so to speak, and certainly as individuals who care about other people, that it's also important that we take care of ourselves, which may mean in between clients and between calls, you literally have to empty your cup so that you don't hold on to whatever, you know, if you talk to someone and they had, you know, just this horrible story, or if it triggers your own history, your own trauma. And so, you know, as Audre Lorde said, you know, self-care is not self-indulgence, it's self-preservative, and that's an act of warfare. And for many of us, you know, maybe as mothers or as fathers taking care of ourselves, you know, our kids, other people, we tend to put ourselves last. So the work we're doing can trigger things. It can be traumatic. And as I mentioned, you know, with our brain and our body, what we need to do is to work on keeping things in balance. So you want to pay attention to, you know, how you're feeling in terms of getting enough sleep, eating right, your own source of support, thinking positive having positive thoughts. If you know you're going into a situation that may be stressful, think about, you know, how it's going to be for you. Not that you intentionally make it that way, but so that you just need to know you may have to take some extra breaths. And one of the reasons that deep breathing really does help you relax is because when you expand your lungs and take really deep inhalations and then expirations, then it kind of just barely impacts your vagal nerve, and your vagal nerve is what innervates your heart. So you do get a sense of lower blood pressure, and you can get calm. And you can actually practice having a mantra with a positive word as you take these inhalations and exhalations. And as Andy mentioned, like, you could do 4 big in breaths, 4 out breaths, repeat it 4 times. So that's 32 seconds. And it really makes a difference. But you can get to the point when you take a breath and have this mantra that you actually get a really good sense of relaxation. And we know over the long haul, people who practice yoga, meditation, actually changes their brain in terms of how quickly, you know, they respond to emotionally charged activity. So it really does help you practice that calm. So you want to think ahead. You want to have a strategy for yourself that can help ground you. For some of you, it may be a prayer, it may be a breath, it may just, you know, whatever you say to yourself that helps you get through it. Take time for yourself afterwards, which means, again, empty your cup, find ways that you can work out, and then also get support and care for yourself. So in terms of, you know, for safekeepers, you know, you just want to be clear about your role, and clear about also when you have questions about your role, who you talk to. You don't want to keep secrets. If there's something that, you know, maybe you said that you're questioning whether you said it, or have something, like, talk it out with somebody. Don't hold things and keep them in. You need to have a clear expectation of what's expected of you in terms of documentation or what you can do. You want to be aware of your own feelings, certainly trust your intuition, keep safety of your clients and the people you interact with definitely top of mind. And when you need help, ask for help. You know, there's no reason, especially as a safekeeper, as a volunteer, but even for you who are on the call, who work in these situations all the time, there's no reason for you not to have the support that you need, but often you may have to help because your supervisor, the people you go to for help, may likely be just as stressed, but you still obviously need to get the help that you need. Andy?
So these are some resources that we pulled together that are specific to here in Sarasota, because I know many of you are working with the Safekeeper project here. I think you want to have these resources at your fingertips. Some of them are national and statewide crisis lines, hotlines that you can use. Some of them are more local. And they could be helpful to you because you need some additional information, or you want to talk to somebody who's an expert. And certainly these are resources that you may want to connect some of the people that you're talking with, you're working with to. So part of your job is to connect people with resources so that they can deal with what's going on in their lives. Make sure they're available, you know, it's available to you. Next slide.
And the only thing I'd say with resources too, like SAMHSA, especially now with COVID, has free resources. You know, be mindful of when we're referring people places, if there's costs associated with it. In most counties now, you can find some sort of treatment, and you may want to familiarize yourself with places that are low cost or no cost to people, so that we're not sending people places where they can't get the help they need.
I think that all the ones we put on that slide are free. So I eliminated a couple that had cost, because I think that's right. We can't be referring people to profit-making enterprises. Yeah.
Not that there's nothing wrong with profit, right? Because healthcare is a business, but we also want to be mindful of what people, what may limit and be a barrier for folks.
You know, going back to the self-care for a second, you don't have to take the slide back, but it occurred to me, I was thinking about this, that it's probably not true for everybody on this call, but for many people, they're really not even aware of their own signs, physical signs of being stressed out. So the first thing that you have to do, or you have to help somebody else do, is recognize when they're stressed out. I mean, it sounds obvious, right? You're stressed out, you would know you were stressed out. But a lot of the early work was actually done by the military on resilience, because they were trying to figure out how to help soldiers be more resilient when they were going into high risk and dangerous situations. And what they found was a large percentage of the new recruits could not identify when they were getting to a dangerous level of stress. They didn't know that they get sweaty palms and their heart rate increases. Somebody else gets butterflies and their legs get jittery. Somebody else gets heart palpitations. Everybody has a different physiological response to stress, and it, you know, can go through like Janet was talking about with red flags. You know, you can learn to identify your own zones. Okay, I'm in the green zone of my own stress. I can feel stressed, but it's probably not interfering with my performance much. A yellow zone, I'm starting to get, you know, I'm getting stressed out and it's starting to interfere. And a red zone, you know what, I'm so stressed out that I can't do my job right now and I got to take a break. I've got to step out of this, get somebody to step in and you know, take my place on this call or whatever. So don't skip that step of knowing yourself well enough that you're going to be able to identify when stress is starting to interfere with your ability and know what you're going to do in that case. So a lot of times we think of self-care as, you know, what do we do to make ourselves feel good after we had a hard day? But it's a lot more than that. You know, we have to know our own triggers, we have to know our own stress responses, and we have to know how to deal with that in the moment as well as afterwards. So that just occurred to me while you were talking, Janet.
No, thank you for saying that, because it truly is a reminder, because I mean, stress is just a word, right? Definitely it's how the body responds, but for individuals, it's important to know how it shows up for you. So thank you.
You know, you remember that you don't have to be a therapist to be therapeutic. You are going to be helpful to the people you meet because you're going to be good listeners. You're going to be there. You're going to be non-judgmental, compassionate, and you would be surprised how much healing gets initiated just by an ordinary person who's willing to listen in a non-judgmental way. You work with trauma survivors, you hear this over and over and over again, that, you know, this was the first person who actually listened to me and believed my story, and that's what started my healing process. So you're going to be out there, you're going to be a healing force, and you're going to run into circumstances, you know, that may be difficult at times. I just want to say that if you are interested in learning more and going a little bit deeper into some of the situations that you might run into, we have people who are willing to meet with groups, do some sort of facilitated peer-to-peer sharing, and help you go a little bit deeper in responding to some of these situations. So the domestic violence stuff we already talked about. There's a lot you can learn from people who work in the domestic violence field about what to watch for, how to respond in a trauma-informed way. A lot more depth than we were able to go into today. Grieving and loss, there's a lot of pain out there. There's a lot of loss that's happening right now on top of the normal circumstances of life. Supporting somebody who's grieving is not rocket science. You know, mostly you just need to acknowledge that that you're sorry for their loss and you're there to listen. But if you wanted to talk to a grief counselor, again, sort of talk through what's most helpful in those circumstances, we have somebody who'd be glad to do that. being with somebody who starts to disclose prior traumatic experiences, I know a lot of people are really worried about that, even a lot of professionals. A lot of mental health professionals who haven't worked with trauma survivors are often a little anxious. Like, what do I do if somebody starts telling me about when they got raped and they get really emotional? You really don't have to worry about that. It's not so hard. Again, you have to listen, validate, be non-judgmental, provide information if people ask for it, but basically you're just there to listen. But again, if you wanted to talk to somebody a little more depth about that, we have somebody who's offered to do that. And Janet mentioned motivational interviewing, which is a very simple set of techniques that anybody can do. You don't have to have a PhD or an MD to do motivational interviewing. And Dr. Janet or others are around who've been trained in that. Again, something, if you have any interest in going deeper in any of these areas or any other area that you're wondering, how do I handle it if? Just feel free to contact us and we can help set something up for you. Janet, you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, I mean, just with grief, understand there's no timetable on grief. And often when someone, you know, is upset about a loss, or natural inclinations to try to fix it, that person has to get through it. And it's just about listening. And if they need more support, certainly offering it, but just not feeling like you have to just say you'll get over it, or, you know, they were sick or whatever. No, just be with them completely.
Yeah, you don't have to come up with something new and creative to say. It's not about you. They just need to know that you're there to listen. That's kind of it.
Okay, that's absolutely right. So
the last slide was just a takeaway. It's my favorite Maya Angelou quote, and I think it captures in a way what your job is. People will forget what you said. People will forget what you did, but people will never forget how you made them feel. So now we have some time for questions, comments, and discussion. This being such a quiet group, we got through this in record time, Janet.
I know.
Janet and Andrea, it's Barbara Sturdivant. You covered so much material tonight, especially when you had your different parts of the brain, and I tried to take as many notes as I could. However, is there any way we can get a copy of what some of the, especially when we talk about the things that I really need when I go for my call? I got some good tips there, but I wasn't able to jot down every single thing that you were saying or the slide was saying. So is there any way that we can have copies of what was presented tonight?
I'm fine with that,
yeah,
Janet.
Yeah, no,
So,
I'm fine as well.
Yeah, it's actually a good idea. We should send out the slide deck to everybody who registered, or at least everybody who is here. Maybe not everybody who registered.
I would truly appreciate it.
Yeah, no, we can do that.
All right.
We are recording this session as well, so we will have, obviously, you know, the commentary from Andrea and Janet, so that will be available.
All right. Thank you.
When it's recorded, Annalise, do the slides show up? Is it video recorded or is it just audio recorded?
No, it records the entire screen, so I have you two talking as well as the slides in between. Okay,
great. So people could actually go back then to, you know, to a slide where they had, you know, they wanted to have a little more time with it and listen to the talk, so they can hear the whole thing and see it. And that will be posted?
It's got it processed after we end the session, so I can get it up later this evening, if not by the morning.
And will it be on the Sarasota Strong website, or where will it be?
Yeah, so we'll have in our past events section, it'll be archived there.
Okay, great. And we can also send out the slide deck to everybody, so if they want to have it on their own computer. Okay, great.
Thank you.
Other questions or comments? We did cover a lot of material here. So if you're confused or you have comments, please we have a few minutes. Take the time and ask.
A wonderful presentation, ladies.
Thank you.
Very, very
Thank you.
well done. Well done.
Thank you.
Ron raised his hand. Go ahead, Ron. Do you have a comment? I'm sure you guys have had experiences that would be worth sharing with the rest of the folks here. Go ahead, Ron.
Is he muted? Is he muted?
He raised his hand and he unmuted himself. This technology still baffles me.
Ron, are you there? Maybe put something in the chat.
He put it in the chat. He would like a copy. We will send a copy of the slide deck to everybody on the call. Annalise, do we have a list of everybody who's actually here?
Yes.
Okay, great.
Ron, what is your last name? Since it's not listed here. Maybe there's only, do you have the list in front of you? I just can't pull it up since I'm recording.
Oh, I have it somewhere.
Let me see, I can probably pull it up on my phone here.
I've got it on. Ronald Larson.
Okay.
That's the only Ron.
Okay,
So
great.
we've got him. Okay, other thoughts, comments? Janet, you want to close it up?
No, just thank you for coming, and certainly utilize the resources. Reach out to us if you need anything, and we appreciate your attention and spending your Thursday evening with us.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks everybody.
All right. Thanks, Andy. Thank you, Annalise.
Thank you, Dr. Daler.
Yeah,
Bye-bye.
you guys have a great
Bye-bye.
evening.